Okay, I'm going to demonstrate troubleshooting the automatic entry door steps that are commonly found on an RV. And before we get started, I wanted to mention there's a couple of things you need to be worried about when safety-wise when you're doing this kind of job: your eyes and your fingers. So whenever you're working underneath a vehicle, you have to be concerned about debris falling into your eyes, rust, dirt, tools, if you drop your tools. So just be careful, wear some safety goggles, and just be careful, try not to work directly under, try not to lay directly under where you're working to protect your eyes. And then the second thing with these entry door steps is if you end up having to remove the whole device, the steps, motor, and everything, just be careful because the steps could collapse. They're kind of heavy, and you're laying underneath there and you're trying to remove that, and then if it just comes off and you have your fingers in between the linkages for the steps, you could end up seriously damaging your fingers, so just be careful with that. I got the RV out of storage this weekend to de-winterize it, and my steps will not retract. So we're going to troubleshoot the problem and fix it. There's a switch up here, step, and that's turned on. So what that means is every time the door closes, the step should retract, and every time the door opens, they should extend. So you can see here, if the door is shut, those steps should have retracted, and they didn't. So I know there's a magnetic sensor here, and I know that it's getting power to the motor because I can hear the motor clicking when I stick a magnet in front of it. That was why I pulled the cover off the battery compartment, was to make sure that there was no missing wires to, I wasn't sure if the step was wired directly to the battery or not. So, but then I took a magnet, and I don't know if you can hear it there, but it's obvious that the motor's getting power. So the next thing to do is crawl under there and see what's going on with the motor. So I may have to pull the whole thing off to get a good look at that. Well, the morning sun is coming right through that step there, so it's putting a glare on here, but this is what the motor looks like, and then the mechanism that's used to pull the step in and out. I suspect that mechanism has got dirt in it, and that's what's keeping the step from extending and retracting, because we could hear the motor clicking like it's trying to engage when I put the magnet in front. So the thing to do is to remove that and see if I can take it apart enough to clean it up. So that'll be the next step. So the wiring comes directly from the battery compartment, and that's this thing right here, and goes into this junction box, and then comes over here through this cable to the motor. So, but there's a connector right here, so I can disconnect completely from that. And then there's this ground wire. The ground wire is connected over here to a nut, so I can disconnect the ground wire there, and then I can remove the whole step. And there's 4 bolts. I think those are 11 millimeter. So, oh, we'll see.
and that should be able to, removing those, and then I should be able to drop the whole step out. I've had it out before to sand and repaint, so it's not that difficult to do. So I had an epiphany. I started to take this whole entire step out, and my thinking was I'm going to have to order a new motor and or transfer mechanism to ultimately fix this thing, and I was going to have to drive the RV back to storage with the step removed because it sticks out too far when I'm driving down the road. But then I decided, well, if it truly is just a dirty motor or a transfer mechanism, then, and I'm able to repair it, then why take the whole step out? So I changed strategy. There's a cotter pin on the end of that pin that goes through there that holds that arm on. So I'm going to remove that cotter pin and then unbolt the 4 bolts that hold that whole piece up on the bottom side of the upper part of the step. So I'll do that first, and then if I need to, I can remove the step if I'm unable to repair it. Well, I got the motor and transfer mechanism removed, but I ended up shearing off one of the bolts because of the rust. So you might want to put some WD-40 on these and let them soak for 15 or 20 minutes before you do what I did. That might help prevent that. So in the end, I'm going to have to remove the whole step anyway, just so I can replace that bolt. So the way this works is this motor drives this servo mechanism, which should turn this in a clockwise direction to pull that arm around, and that'll cause the step to retract. Right now it's in the extended position. The steps would be extended. So I could hear the motor trying to run when I put the magnet on the sensor at the door. So if the motor's running and this isn't turning, then it's probably this servo mechanism's froze up. And so what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and put this crescent wrench on here. This is my outdoor workbench, my trash dumpster. I'm going to try and take that crescent wrench, put it on here, and see if I can turn this. If I can turn it and break it loose, then it's probably just dirt that's gotten in there. If I'm unable to turn it, I'm going to get a bigger crescent wrench. And if I'm still unable to turn it, then I'm going to have to order a new servo mechanism. And I'll probably order a new motor since I'll have it all apart. And so we'll give it a shot. Well, I was not able to turn it with the crescent wrench, so it could be because the motor's engaged and not got power on it, or it could just be the thing is just frozen up tight from dirt. So what I'm going to do is pull these 3 screws off, pull this cover off, and see if I can see what's going on. Okay, I've taken the cover and the motor off. When you take the cover off, all you can see is the motor. So you have to take the motor off. And once I was able to do that, by the way, those are 5/16 inch bolts, so you need a 5/16 socket. But once I did that, this moved freely, which now has me thinking the motor's froze up. So I think what I'm going to try and do next is reconnect that ground wire I had removed underneath the coach. Reconnect that ground wire and plug that, just the motor in, hold it there in my hand, and try the magnet and see what happens when power gets to the motor. I suspect that it's not turning the servo there. So if that's the case, then definitely a new motor. So let me get all set up for that, and then we'll see what happens. Okay, I've got the motor plugged into the wiring harness. I hooked the ground wire back up. The step switch is in the on position, and we're going to take the magnet. We switch hands here, and we're going to stick it in front and just see what happens. Okay, so the motor's turning. Well, if the motor's turning and the servo's turning, I'm not sure what's the problem. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is put the motor back on the servo. Come over here and do the same test up here where I can see it. The step moves freely, so it's not the step binding. Right now everything appears to work normally. So let me go get the servo and hook it back, put it back together, and see what happens. Okay, I have it all back together now. I did do a little cleanup with some denatured alcohol, because as I started to put this back together, I could hear some grittiness, and I wanted to make sure that there was nothing getting in, especially where these parts move. So I did a little cleanup just in case it does work. If it does work, then I'm going to put it all back together and consider it done. But and so I didn't want to have to take it back out and clean it up. So anyways, we'll go plug it in now and see what happens. Okay, here we go for the test. Okay, so the moral of this story is there was either a loose connection electrically, which I find hard to believe because I could hear the motor trying to kick when I put the power on it. So there's no electrical connection past the motor, so it's all mechanical after that. So the other possibility is there was just some grit and some dirt in this area or in this area right here, where it pivots around that, and it was causing it to bind. That's the only other possibility I can think of. So, and most likely possibility is that is what it was. Okay, so unfortunately, because I sheared that bolt off, I got to pull the whole step assembly out, run down to Lowe's and get a small carriage bolt replacement. I'm sure that's a carriage bolt that's in there, and then I can put the whole thing back together and hope it still works. Okay, so I've removed the step assembly and went to Lowe's and picked up some replacement carriage bolts, lock washers, and nuts, and I picked up a new cotter pin. It's always a good idea to replace the cotter pin. You don't want this to fatigue and break and fall out while you're going down the road or something. So I had one break on my lawnmower, dropped the front of my lawnmower deck while I was mowing one time, and the RV went from however fast it was going to complete stop in less than a second, and I ended up almost going over the steering wheel on it. So it's a good idea to replace those cotter pins whenever you have them out. So we'll go ahead and reinstall the motor assembly here, and then we'll place the steps back on the RV. Okay, I've got the motor reinstalled with the new bolts and the new cotter pin, and clip the wire back into the clips here. Everything I can do out here is easier than doing it laying on my back underneath. So we're ready to put the step assembly back on the RV now and give it a good test. Okay, I got the step reinstalled and everything's hooked up, so let's give it a test. Alright, so what it ended up being was just some dirt and grit. It had set for a while. It had set for several months in storage and in the extended position, and I think it just got some dirt or grit in there that kept it from moving. So it was just a matter of getting it cleaned up, which is lucky for me. I don't have to buy a motor or a servo mechanism, but I was prepared to do that. I understand you can order those from the manufacturer or through Amazon or probably other RV supply warehouses. So and the process is the same. If you determine the motor's bad or the mechanism's bad, you can just order the part and replace it. And you might want to consider, depending upon how old the step is, replacing both while you have it all apart. But in my case, I got lucky, and you may get lucky too. So try cleaning it and testing it before you replace it, and you might save yourself a lot of money.